All right. Are we ready for a witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Plaintiff's now called Dr. Herrera, and Mr. Dettmer will be conducting the examination.
Very well.
Good morning, Your Honor. Ethan.
Good morning, Mr. Dettmer.
Thank you.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. State your name, please.
My name is Gregory M. Herrick. It's H-E-R-E-K.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor Herrick.
Good morning.
Can you please describe for the court your educational background?
Yes, I received my doctorate in social psychology from the University of California in 1983.
I'm sorry, what was the field in which you received your doctorate?
In social psychology. It's a sub-discipline of psychology.
Can you describe for the court briefly what is social psychology?
Well, social psychology is actually a field that intersects psychology and sociology. It's the study of human behavior and experiences within a social context.
And can you describe for the court what was the subject of your dissertation?
Well, my dissertation focused on heterosexuals' attitudes towards lesbians and gay men.
When did you receive your PhD?
1983.
Did you continue your research after you received your PhD?
Yes, after receiving my PhD, I received the postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University, and I worked there for 2 years.
And what was your subject of your research at Yale?
Well, at Yale, I continued my research from my graduate school dissertation on attitudes towards lesbians and gay men. I also expanded my research in looking at attitudes and the stigma attached to HIV and AIDS, which at the time was a relatively new phenomena in the United States, and I also studied some other areas as well.
And what did you do after you left Yale?
Well, actually, I said I was there for 2 years. That was for my postdoc. I was invited to stay on for a year after I completed my postdoc, and I taught taught classes, at Yale for 1 year. And after that, I was appointed as an assistant professor at the City University of New York's graduate school in their program in social and personality psychology.
And how long were you at the City University of New York?
3 years.
And after that, what was your next employment?
After that, I returned to California, and I took a position as an associate research psychologist at the University of California. The research psychologist position is in a series that's parallel to the professor series, but there's no teaching involved. It focuses entirely on research.
And did you ever receive tenure at Davis?
Well, I was an associate research psychologist and then promoted to full research psychologist. And then in 1999, I was appointed as a tenured full professor at UC Davis, and that's been my position since then.
And what sort of courses do you teach at Davis?
Well, right now I regularly teach a course called Sexual Orientation and Prejudice, which is a course that deals with a variety of topics related to sexual orientation as well as to social stigma and individual prejudice based on sexual orientation. I also regularly teach a graduate methods course in which I teach students the methodological techniques associated with conducting survey and questionnaire research. I also teach an undergraduate version of that course, and I teach occasional seminars on various topics, including topics related to sexual orientation and to stigma and prejudice.
Now, do you have exhibit binders up there? I'm sorry.
I don't believe I do.
Sorry. Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
My apologies, Your Honor. Professor Herrick, if you could please turn to 2326 in that binder. Sorry, it's in the second volume, Your Honor.
What's the number again?
2326.
2326?
Yes, sir. Yes, Your Honor. Professor Herrick, what is that document, Exhibit 2326?
This is my curriculum vitae.
Okay. Your Honor, we would move Exhibit 2326 into evidence.
No objection.
Very well.
Now, Professor Herrick, have you served on the editorial board of any peer-reviewed journals?
Yes, I serve on several editorial boards.
Okay, what type of journals do you serve on the editorial board?
Well, there are a variety, and they're listed in the vitae. For example, I'm on the editorial board of a journal called Basic and Applied Social Psychology, which, as the name suggests, is a social psychological research journal. I am on the board of the Journal of Sex Research, which is an interdisciplinary research journal devoted to issues around sexuality, and there are several others that are listed in the vitae.
Are you a member of any professional associations?
Yes, I'm a member and a fellow of the American Psychological Association, the Association for Psychological Science, the Society for Experimental Social Psychology, and several other associations that are also listed in my vitae.
Professor Herrich, have you authored any scholarly writing in your subject matter?
Yes, I have.
Can you describe briefly the types of writings you've authored?
Well, I've published approximately 100 articles and chapters in journals and edited volumes that cover topics related to sexual orientation, stigma, prejudice, and related topics.
Have you received grant funding for your research?
Yes, I have.
About how much and from where?
Well, over the course of my career, I've received in excess of $5 million in grant funding, most of it from the National Institutes of Health.
Your Honor, the plaintiffs would tender Dr. Herrich as an expert on social psychology with a focus on sexual orientation and stigma.
Very well. Any voir dire?
No objection.
Very well. You may proceed, Mr. Dettmer.
Thank you, Your Honor. Professor Herrich, do you intend to offer any opinions in this matter?
Yes, I do.
And what opinions do you intend to offer?
Well, I intend to offer opinions concerning the nature of sexual orientation and how it is understood in the fields of psychology and psychiatry today, about the amenability of sexual orientation to change through interventions and through various intervention techniques, and the nature of stigma and prejudice as they relate to sexual orientation and as they are related to Proposition 8.
Now, Professor Herrich, I've given the court reporter a copy of a list of the exhibits that are in the binders there. And I'd like, if I may, Your Honor, to offer you a copy as well. And if I may, Dr. Herrich, Your Honor, may I approach?
You may.
I've handed Professor Herrich a list of exhibits that are in the binders in front of him. And just for the sake of efficiency, I've run these exhibits by Mr. Nielsen, and I understand that they will have no objection to the admission of these documents.
That is correct, Your Honor.
Very well. I appreciate your cooperation.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Professor Herrich, I know you've had a chance to look at this list before, but with the exception of 5 exhibits listed there, 2265, 2563, 2564, 2565, and 2567, are those exhibits documents or studies that you've relied on in reaching your opinions in this case?
Yeah, I believe so. Could you say the numbers one more time?
Yes, certainly. The exhibits I'm accepting are 2265, 2563.
Oh, 2265. Oh, I see. Okay, sorry.
That's quite all right. 2564, 2565, and 2567. With the exception of those 5 documents, are the exhibits listed there the exhibits among the documents you've relied on in reaching your opinions in this case?
I believe 2350 is not one that I relied on.
Thank you. Any other exceptions to that?
No, I don't think so.
Now, turning to your opinions, Dr. Herrich, can you describe for the court what is sexual orientation?
Well, sexual orientation is a term that we use to describe an enduring sexual, romantic, or intensely affectional attraction to men, to women, or to both men and women. It's also used to refer to an identity or a sense of self that is based on one's enduring patterns of attraction, and it's also sometimes used to describe an enduring pattern of behavior. So, sexual behaviors with men, with women, or with both men and women.
You've described 3 different aspects of that definition. Can you give examples of how those aspects are used in different contexts?
Well, researchers use them in different contexts depending upon their focus in a particular research study. So, for example, in public health research, it's often the case that the focus is on, say, sexually transmitted diseases or other aspects of sexual behavior. So, in that context, sexual orientation is often defined in operational terms according to patterns of sexual behavior. In other areas, we might be interested in looking at, for example, the effects of discrimination on people who are lesbian, gay, or bisexual. And in that context, we would probably focus on identity, on terms that people use to identify themselves in terms of their sexual orientation. So it really varies somewhat depending upon the research context.
Okay, now that's a definition used by researchers and experts in the field. Do you, in your research, ask ordinary lay people about their own sexual orientation?
Yes, I've done that frequently.
And do you find that ordinary people have an understanding of their own sexual orientation?
Well, when I ask the question and when other research asks the questions in surveys, we typically don't use terms like sexual orientation because that has a technical quality to it, and we don't expect people to necessarily know that specific term. So what we typically do is to ask people if they are heterosexual or straight, gay, lesbian, or bisexual, and that's a question people generally are able to answer fairly easily.
I gather when you say ordinary people, you mean people without professional training.
Well, that's correct, Your Honor. People outside the field of Professor Herrick's expertise. Professor Herrick, where do relationships fit in to what we've been discussing?
Well, you know, really, sexual orientation is at its heart a relational construct because it is all about a relationship of some sort between one individual and another, and a relationship that is defined by the sex of the two persons involved, whether male and female, male and male, female and female. It is, whether we are talking about behavior or attraction or identity, it is really about the fundamental relationships that people form to meet their needs for intimacy and attachment.
And why are these issues important in your view?
Well, because those sort of relationships that need for intimacy, that need for attachment, is a very core part of human experience and a very fundamental need that people have.
Switching to a different topic, is homosexuality considered a mental disorder?
No.
And why do you say that?
Well, the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, and other of the major professional mental health associations have all gone on record affirming that homosexuality is a normal expression of sexuality, that it is not in any way a form of pathology.
Does homosexuality have any impact on one's ability to contribute to society?
There's no inherent relationship between a person's sexual orientation and their ability to be productive and contributing members of society, to be happy, to lead a fulfilling life.
Has homosexuality ever in the past been seen as a mental disorder?
Yes.
Okay, and can you describe the history of that?
Well, if we go back to the early part of the 20th century, we see that there was a great deal of discussion and debate. In 1952, the American Psychiatric Association created its first official roster of mental illnesses, and it was called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or the DSM for short. And homosexuality was included in that first edition of the DSM, and over time, that inclusion was disputed, and there were many challenges to it, such that by 1973, just about 20 years later, the American Psychiatric Association removed homosexuality from its DSM, and shortly after that, the American Psychological Association went on record strongly supporting the decision by the Psychiatric Association.
Thank you. If I could ask you in the first volume of your exhibits there to turn to Exhibit 885, that's PX 885. Can you please tell the court what this document is?
Yes, this is a copy of that first Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders that was published in 1952.
And could you please turn to pages 38 and 39 under the heading? Sorry. I'll wait until you get there.
Okay.
Under the heading Sexual Deviation, is that what you've been referring to?
Right. This is one of the subheadings under sociopathic personality disturbances, and sexual deviation includes homosexuality as a diagnosis.
Now, if I could ask you then to turn earlier in that same volume to page 76. I'm sorry, to Exhibit 764.
7-4?
764, Your Honor. Professor Herrick, if you could please describe for the court what this document is.
Well, this is the policy statement that I was referring to earlier when I said that the American Psychological Association had endorsed the action by the psychiatrists. This was their resolution that was passed by the Council of Representatives, which is their legislative body, in 1975, affirming that, quote, homosexuality per se implies no impairment in judgment, stability, reliability, or general social and vocational capabilities. And it goes on to say that, quote, the American Psychological Association urges all mental health professionals to take the lead in removing the stigma of mental illness that has long been associated with homosexual orientations.
And do you understand that position that you've just read to still be the position of the American Psychological Association?
Yes, in fact, the APA has reaffirmed that position in several subsequent resolutions.
Okay.
What led to the change?
To the change in 1973
Yes.
with the psychiatrists, well, that's a long story, I think.
Well, we're here for those.
Okay. There was a great deal of debate and argument about it. It's perhaps instructive to ask how homosexuality got in the DSM in the first place, and it turns out that there was not a great deal of empirical data to support it. It actually reflected more common knowledge and assumption among many psychiatrists in the 1940s and the 1950s. By the 1970s, that common wisdom was being challenged both in the form of empirical research that was showing that there certainly were people who were homosexual who were very well adjusted, and other than the label of being homosexual, showed no indication that they were suffering from any sort of mental disorder. And there was also a change in the culture that was leading many individuals and institutions to rethink their previous positions about homosexuality, and that included psychiatrists and psychologists. Those events and patterns sort of culminated in 1973 when the board of directors of the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM based on their understanding of the empirical research as it existed at that time.
So you're saying that the position that's reflected in the first DSM, Plaintiff's Exhibit 885, was not based upon empiricism, but the change reflected in Exhibit 764, the statement in 1975, was based on empirical evidence. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement, and I would say that it was not only empirical data. There were, the times had changed, and there was a new perspective that no longer viewed homosexuality as this necessarily bad thing, this thing that was necessarily indicative of mental illnesses. But there was also empirical studies that had been conducted that had failed to support the view of homosexuality as a mental illness. I would also just point out this resolution is the one passed by the psychologists in 75. They were endorsing the resolution by the psychiatrists, which was in 73.
Thank you. Mr. Dettmer?
Thank you, Your Honor. Moving to a slightly different topic, Professor Herrera, do people choose their sexual orientation?
Well, I've conducted research that in which I found that the vast majority of lesbians and gay men, and most bisexuals as well, when asked if they feel that how much choice they've had and given their sexual orientation about being gay or lesbian or bisexuals, say that they have they have experienced no choice or very little choice about that.
Are you familiar with the terms reparative therapy or sexual orientation change therapy?
Yeah, I am familiar with those terms.
Can you explain what those terms mean?
Well, those are terms that are used to refer to various types of interventions that are intended to alter a person's sexual orientation, to change them from becoming homosexual into heterosexual.
Have those types of therapies been found to be effective?
Well, before I answer that, it's useful maybe to say what constitutes effectiveness or how we think about effectiveness. When we use the word effective in connection with therapeutic interventions, what we mean is, what we mean is that an intervention or a therapy has been shown to consistently work, to consistently produce the outcome that it's supposed to produce in the population for which it is designed, and that it does so without causing harm to the individuals involved. And with those standards, no, various reparative therapies or sexual orientation change therapies have not been found to be effective.
Has the American Psychological Association taken a stand on these type of therapies?
Yes, it has.
And can you describe how it came to take a stand on those?
Well, these therapies have been around for a long time, and there's been a great deal of discussion and debate about them. The APA has considered them a number of times. Most recently, it convened a task force. And I believe the task force was convened in 2008 or 2009. It produced its report in 2009. But this was a task force that was given the task of evaluating the current status of these therapies and to produce a report advising the association on their effectiveness, their safety, and whether or not they should be used.
And what were the conclusions reached as a result of those studies?
Well, the task force did a very thorough review of the research literature and, first of all, found that there were actually not very many high-quality studies that had been conducted that could actually speak to the effectiveness of these therapies. But when one looks at the studies that are available and that have used the methods of sufficient quality, what one finds is that they are of very limited effectiveness and are also potentially associated with some harms to individuals.
If I could ask you to turn to Exhibit 888 in your first binder. And also, if we could have, I'd like to publish a first demonstrative, Your Honor. Professor Herrera, could you please tell the court what Exhibit 888 is?
Well, this is the cover of the report from the task force that I just mentioned.
Okay, and 888 in your binder is, can you describe what that?
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. It's the report of the American Psychological Association Task Force on appropriate therapeutic responses to sexual orientation. And yes, the entire report is here in my binder.
Okay. If we could move to the next demonstrative, please. If you look on pages 2 to 3 of Exhibit 888, do you find the conclusion here of the task force?
Yes.
And do you mind reading that, please, into the record? It's also on your screen there.
Oh, okay. Yeah, actually, it's easier to read from the screen. Enduring change to an individual's sexual orientation is uncommon. The participants in this body of research continue to experience same-sex attractions following SOCE, which is that's an acronym for sexual orientation change efforts, and did not report significant change to other sex attractions that could be empirically validated, though some showed lessened physiological arousal to all sexual stimuli. Compelling evidence of decreased same-sex sexual behavior and of engagement in sexual behavior with other sex was rare. Few studies provided strong evidence that any change produced in laboratory conditions translated to daily life. Thus, the results of scientifically valid research indicate that it is unlikely that individuals will be able to reduce same-sex attractions or increase other sex sexual attraction through SOCE.
Thank you. Are these conclusions consistent with your own opinion?
Yes.
Do you know whether the task force made any conclusions with respect to the safety of these type of therapies?
Well, the task force pointed out that just as there are problems with the research on the effectiveness, which make it difficult to say that there is a cause and effect relationship between any changes that occurred in and the actual participation in the therapy, they also found that there were many anecdotal reports of individuals who felt that they had experienced harm related to these therapies. There were some instances in those rigorous experimental studies that did document individuals experiencing harm in the form of, say, depression or anxiety problems. There were also self-reports of individuals who said that they felt that they had been harmed by the therapies. But I would hasten to point out that those are self-reports of people's perceptions, and so to show that they actually experienced those harms as a result of the therapy is somewhat tenuous. We can't assume that that's absolutely true, but there have been reports of harm.
Is a mental health professional or a scholar in the mental health field more concerned about self-reports of harm as opposed to self-reports of other types of instances?
Well, I would say we give great weight to concerns about harm. One of the first things you want to do with any sort of intervention, whether it's pharmaceutical or therapy, is to make sure that it doesn't harm people. So in a sense, I would say there's a lower bar for concerns about harms to individual. And so we would take very seriously those self-reports of people feeling that they had experienced harm as a result of these therapies and would certainly want to evaluate them carefully.
Do you know whether the American Psychological Association adopted any resolutions based on this work?
Yes, there was a resolution that was adopted in response to the task force report.
I'd ask you to turn to page 120 of this exhibit, 888. And on page 120, do you see that these are resolutions that you were referring to?
Yes. Yes, this is the text of the resolution that was adopted by the American Psychological Association.
And just for the record, could you read the two operative resolutions there that are on the screen?
Be it further resolved that the American Psychological Association reaffirms its position that homosexuality per se is not a mental disorder and opposes portrayals of sexual minority youths and adults as mentally ill due to their sexual orientation. Be it further resolved that the American Psychological Association concludes that there is insufficient evidence to support the use of psychological interventions to change sexual orientation.
Now, are these conclusions consistent with your own opinion?
Yes.
Are you aware of any other major mental health organizations that have endorsed the use of these therapies?
That have endorsed them? No.
Are there specific concerns surrounding these types of therapies when used with adolescents?
Well, I think there's a concern when they're used with anyone, but adolescents are a special case for a variety of reasons. Adolescents are at a very formative stage in their life where they are typically just developing their sexuality, and also adolescents are frequently in a fairly vulnerable situation in terms of not being in complete control of their lives. And there's a concern that has been expressed by the American Psychological Association in actually a previous resolution to this one, that they were concerned that adolescents who went through these interventions might often not be able to provide true informed consent, that they might actually be coerced into going through these interventions, and that could also be especially harmful to the adolescent person. Also, it's important to realize that the underlying assumptions of these therapies tends to be that there's something wrong, that homosexuality is a mental illness, that it's something that needs to be cured or something that needs to be fixed or repaired, and that, of course, is completely inconsistent with the stance of the American Psychological Association, the American Psychiatric Association, and other professional organizations in this area. And so they have pointed out that this message might be especially harmful to transmit to adolescents who are just in the formative stage of their sexuality.
Could I ask you to turn to Exhibit 2338, which is in the smaller binder there? Do you know what that document is, Professor Herrera?
Yes, this is a pamphlet called Just the Facts About Sexual Orientation in Youth, a primer for principals, educators, and school personnel. It was created by and co-sponsored by a number of mental health associations, as well as some teacher and school professional associations.
All right, and looking at the first page of that document, it lists the organizations that endorse this publication?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
The American Academy of Pediatrics, American Association of School Administrators, American Counseling Association, American Federation of Teachers, American Psychological Association, American School Counselor Association, American School Health Association, Interfaith Alliance Foundation, National Association of School Psychologists, National Association of Secondary School Principals, National Association of Social Workers, National Education Association, and the School Social Work Association of America. Is that consistent with your understanding of who's endorsed this particular publication?
Yes.
And if you turn to page 14 of this document, I'm sorry, it's not page 14.
No, I don't think it's page 14.
My apologies. Page 1 of this document? My apologies. I'm going to start over. Page 5 lists the conclusion here and the findings of these organizations. Excuse me, Your Honor. Could you read, please, the findings of these organizations as set forth in this document?
Despite the general consensus of major medical health and mental health professions that both heterosexuality and homosexuality are normal expressions of human sexuality, efforts to change through therapy have been adopted by some political and religious organizations and aggressively promoted to the public. However, such efforts have serious potential to harm young people because they present the view that the sexual orientation of lesbian, gay, and bisexual youth is a mental illness or disorder, and they often frame the inability to change one's sexual orientation as a personal and moral failure.
And are these findings consistent with your own opinion?
Yes.
Now I'd like to change to a different topic. Do you understand, Professor Herrera, that gay men and lesbians can actually get married in California today?
Well, they can marry someone of the other sex.
Is that a realistic option for gay men or lesbians?
For the vast majority of gay men and lesbians, that's not a realistic option.
And why do you say that?
Well, as I said earlier, sexual orientation is really about the relationships that an individual forms. It really defines the universe of people with whom one is going to be able to form the sort of intimate, committed relationship that would be the basis for marriage.
Despite that, have gay men and lesbians gotten married to people of the opposite sex?
Yes, they have.
Do you know of reasons why that happens?
Well, there's a variety of reasons why it's happened. We know that in some cases people have gotten married at a time in life when they really hadn't quite understood their own sexuality, and it was only after being married sometime later that they realized that they themselves were gay or lesbian. In other cases, people might have known or at least had strong suspicion that they were gay or lesbian at the time that they married, but they married because they were subjected to intense social pressure to do so, because they hoped that, perhaps by marrying, this would change them, that they would become heterosexual as a result, that this would somehow, help them to not be gay anymore. There are a variety of reasons, but those are just a few examples.
Is this a problem with those sorts of marriages, with gay men and lesbians marrying somebody of the opposite sex?
Well, it's certainly not the case that all of those marriages dissolve, but many of them do, and many of them experience considerable problems just because of the fact that one of the partners is gay or lesbian. And it's certainly, especially if it's something which is typically the case, that the other spouse, did not know when they went into the marriage. It is likely to create a great deal of conflict and tension in the relationship, and it is just going to create many, many problems, not only for the couple, but also if they have children, perhaps for the children, for other members of of their extended families, for their friends. It's a ripple effect. It can create problems for all sorts of different people.
Now, do you understand that lesbians and gay men in California who are in a same-sex relationship can enter into domestic partnerships?
Yes.
Do you understand that domestic partnerships have most of the same rights and privileges as marriage?
It's my understanding that domestic partners in California have virtually all the same rights and privileges as married couples.
So is all we're talking about a word? Is the only difference that we're talking about here between the word marriage and domestic partnership?
I would say it's not simply a word, no.
Why do you say that?
Well, I think that if we look at, for example, public opinion data, what we see is that there's a sizable proportion of the public, both in California and in the United States, who say that they are willing to let same-sex couples have domestic partnerships or civil unions or something that gives them the benefits of marriage without calling it marriage. And yet they are willing to extend those benefits, but they are not willing to extend marriage to same-sex couples, which suggests that in the minds of a large number of Americans, there is some distinction between domestic partnerships and marriage, that it's not simply a word, that there's more to it than that. I think also if we look at the recent history of California, when it became possible for same-sex couples to marry, thousands of them did, and many of those who did were domestic partners. So clearly, they thought there was something different about getting married. And I would say that just the fact that we're here today suggests that this is more than just a word, that there's clearly a great deal of strong feeling and emotion about the difference between marriage and domestic partnership.
Does marriage encourage the stability of a relationship?
Yes, it does.
And why do you say that?
Well, researchers who look at committed relationships usually think of the factors that contribute to long-term commitment and stability in terms of both the rewards that the relationship has and the barriers to leaving, barriers to dissolution. So on the one hand, people are brought together and stay together for positive reasons. They like and love their partner. They enjoy being with their partner. They experience many positive things as a result of being with that person. But when people are married, there are also a number of barriers that make it not an easy thing to simply dissolve the marriage. And these refer to both legal barriers as well as to social barriers. For example, the expectations of family and friends, the idea that the members of their community, the members of their family, their friends, circles, they're likely to be hoping and pulling for a couple to stay together, to stay married. There are many other sort of barriers to dissolution that exists with marriage. And the point about that is that we know that relationships are more likely to be stable and enduring when they are based primarily on rewards, on those positive things that people get. But the barriers can be an incentive or an encouragement for individuals who might be going through a rough patch to try to resolve those problems, try to work things out rather than separating. And it may well be the case that they do get through that rough patch and they are able to maintain the marriage over the long term. And so in that sense, these barriers can be helpful in maintaining the stability of the relationship.
Do domestic partnerships create those same barriers?
We're lacking in a great deal of empirical data, but I would say no. Domestic partnerships are not perceived in the same way as marriages in terms of those barriers.
And have you seen illustrations of that observation with respect to domestic partnerships in California?
Well, I think one interesting example that illustrates that fact is that in 2004, the California legislature enacted legislation that increased the benefits and responsibilities associated with domestic partnerships. And what that meant was that there were going to be changes of all sorts associated with being a domestic partner. And in 2004, and that law was going to go into effect at the beginning of 2005. In 2004, the California Secretary of State mailed a letter to all registered domestic partners in the state advising them of these changes and, in essence, saying you should consider whether or not you want to dissolve your domestic partnership in light of these changes that are going to occur in the law, which may have an impact on you, especially a financial impact. I find it difficult to imagine that if there were changes in the tax laws that were going to affect married couples, that you would have had the state government sending letters to people suggesting that they consider whether or not they want to get divorced before this new law goes into effect. I think that that letter just illustrates the way in which domestic partners are viewed differently than marriage.
If I could ask you to turn to Exhibit 2265 in your binder, please. It's the second binder.
Okay.
Is that the letter you're referring to, Professor Herrera?
Yes.
Do you know whether domestic partnerships were in fact dissolved in California as a result of this?
Well, yes. Some researchers at UCLA were tracking the numbers of dissolutions of domestic partnerships, and it's very interesting. What they found was that there was an increase in domestic partnership dissolutions leading up to the end of 2004. And in fact, in December of 2004, there was a huge spike in the number of domestic partnerships that were dissolved in California, presumably in anticipation of this new law and perhaps in response to this letter that was sent from the Secretary of State.
And do you know whether there's empirical study of that?
Yeah, the UCLA researchers that I was mentioning had actually tracked that.
Could you turn to Exhibit 909, please, in your binder?
Okay.
Is this the study you are referring to?
Yes.
And Figure 9 in this exhibit, which is on page 15, do you know what that what that figure portrays?
Yeah, this is a bar chart that that shows what I was describing just a minute ago. Now, what you see is that these are the numbers of monthly dissolutions of domestic partnerships in California through the last half of 2004 and the beginning of 2005, and where you see that that very tall bar with 1188 above it, that was the number of dissolutions in December, right before the new law went into effect. And what you see is it's a pretty dramatic spike right there.
Now, are you aware of any studies that have been done of the effect of actually getting married for same-sex couples?
Well, you know, this is a fairly new phenomena, and so there isn't a great deal of empirical data on married same-sex couples. I am familiar with one study that was conducted by the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, or the State Department of Public Health, in which they asked a number of questions of Massachusetts married couples, same-sex married couples, about their experiences and their impressions of their marriage.
Okay, do you know what the conclusions of that were?
Well, I think that one, there were a number of different conclusions in the study, but I think the one that was very interesting and perhaps relevant to what I was just saying is that most of the couples, in excess of 70% of the couples, said that as a result of getting married, they felt that their commitment to their relationship had strengthened.
Now, switching topics, are you familiar with the term stigma?
Yes, I'm familiar with that term.
What does that term mean?
Well, stigma is a kind of shared cultural knowledge. It's a knowledge about particular characteristics or attributes of groups that are viewed negatively by the society, such that the members of those groups or individuals with those characteristics or attributes are devalued. They're looked down upon, and they're treated differently, such that they end up having less control over the course of their own lives, less influence over others, less access to the valued resources of society, all of which are what we think of as power. So they have less power than other individuals.
And are you familiar with the term structural stigma?
Yes.
And what does that term mean?
Well, structural stigma is a term that we use in contrast to individual manifestations of stigma. So that cultural belief, that shared knowledge about certain groups being devalued, can be expressed by individuals through ostracism, negative statements, even violence and discrimination. But there are also, stigma is also manifested in the institutions of society, in which case it doesn't matter who the particular individuals are who are inhabiting that institution at the time. This is just a part of the institution itself. So, for example, a good example of structural stigma is the law. The legal institutions that designate certain groups as lacking certain resources relative to others. That's an instance of structural stigma.
Are gay men and lesbians stigmatized today?
Yes.
And why do you say that?
Well, we have a great deal of research showing that lesbians and gay men face stigma. We know that, looking at national survey data, that there are a large number of people who will say that they have negative feelings towards lesbians and gay men, that they feel disgusted by lesbians and gay men. We have instances of discrimination and violence against people who are lesbian and gay. The FBI and the state of California both track hate crimes perpetrated against people because of their sexual orientation. In a national survey study that I conducted with a nationally representative sample of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults, I found that roughly 1 in 5 of people in the sample had experienced some sort of violence based on their sexual orientation in the course of their lifetime, and a slightly lower percentage of lesbians and gay men had experienced some sort of discrimination, for example, in employment at some time during their lifetime. We see instances of violence and harassment in the public schools against children and youth who are perceived being gay or lesbian, and I think at a sort of intuitive level, I think that most people understand that if 2 men were to walk down the street holding hands in many places, that would elicit a great deal of negative reaction. And that's an instance of the sort of stigma I think everyone is aware of, and that is faced by people who are lesbian or gay.
How is structural stigma related to the instances of discrimination or harassment or violence that you've mentioned?
Well, as I mentioned a moment ago, those are individual manifestations, individuals carrying out those acts, but they do that within a context, within a broader social context. And structural stigma, basically provides that context. It identifies which members of society are devalued, and in a sense, it gives a level of permission to denigrate or attack particular groups or members who are perceived to be members of a particular group in society.
Does the stigma that you've described extend beyond just gay men and lesbians to same-sex relationships?
Oh, yes. And in fact, in some psychological research where, for various methodological reasons, the researchers wanted to ascertain reactions based on visual images rather than on words or descriptions, they have sometimes used photographs of same-sex couples and used that as a way of conveying the idea of homosexuality or gay men and lesbians. And what they found is that they get substantially more negative reactions to those photographs of same-sex couples than they do to photographs of people in different sex couples.
Is Proposition 8 an instance of structural stigma?
Well, by definition, it is, yes. It's part of the legal system, and it differentiates people in same-sex relationships from those in heterosexual relationships. So in a definitional sense, yes.
Now, I want to go back, actually, to some of your earlier testimony and ask you a couple of follow-up questions about just one aspect of your testimony earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember earlier I asked you if people chose their sexual orientation?
Yes.
And you had described some research that you did surrounding that?
Yes.
Can I ask you a couple of follow-up questions about that?
Sure.
Okay, could you look at Exhibit 928 in your binder?
Yes.
Okay, can you explain what this document is?
Well, this is a paper that I published with two colleagues in the Journal of Counseling Psychology in 2009.
And does this document contain some of the findings that you had described about people's perception of their own sexual orientation?
Yeah, as part of this, the study that's described in this paper, we asked members of a community sample that we had collected in the Sacramento area. It was approximately 2,200 people. Among other things, we asked them questions about the extent to which how much choice they felt they had about being lesbian or gay or bisexual. And on page 39 of the paper, there is a table that reports the frequencies of responses to this. And so for purposes of the study, these were referred to as essentialist beliefs.
What is that?
I'm sorry, essentialist beliefs. And what you see there is that among the gay men, 87% said they experienced no choice or only a little choice about their sexual orientation, compared to 13% who said they felt they had some choice, a fair amount of choice, or a lot of choice. Among lesbians, it was 70% who said no choice or very little. Among bisexual men, it was 59% who said no choice or a little. And among bisexual women, it was 45%.
Thank you. And you also mentioned that you have a more recent study that addresses the same topic, is that right?
Yes.
And can you turn to Exhibit 930 in your binder?
Yes.
Is that the more recent study that you've referred to?
Yes.
And can you describe briefly the findings on that topic in this study?
Yes, this is, by the way, this is a study that has been accepted for publication, but it hasn't been published yet. So this is a sort of a manuscript version of it. But on page 33 of the manuscript, that's the wrong page. On page 27 of the manuscript, you see that the percentages are reported there for a similar question. In that group, in that table, you see that 88% of gay men said they had no choice at all, with approximately 7% saying they had a small amount of choice. For lesbians, it's about 68% saying no choice at all, and another 15% saying a small amount of choice. For bisexual men, it's about 38% and 22%, and for bisexual women, it's about 40% and 15% saying no choice or a small amount of choice.
Now, are you aware of any empirical studies in which heterosexual men and women were asked about their sexual orientation?
No, I'm not.
do you have any sense, based on your research, of what heterosexual men and women do believe about their sexual orientation?
Well, I think it would be a reasonable hypothesis to say that probably most heterosexual men and women, if they were asked the question and if they thought about it, would probably report that they similarly don't experience, that they don't feel that they made a choice to be heterosexual. But that's a hypothesis. I don't have data that would show that.
Now let me just finish turning back to the topic we were last on regarding structural stigma in Proposition 8. And I'm sorry to go out of order here. There was testimony in this case, and I'll ask to have it put on the screen, from a woman who was married in San Francisco in 2004 and whose marriage was later invalidated. I'll just read it for the record. This is the testimony of Helen Zia in this trial. It says, quote, we, for a brief moment in time, experienced a feeling of what equality is, but instead of having to go to the fountain that is just for gay and lesbian people, here we could go to the fountain that formerly said heterosexuals only, and we tasted the water that was sweeter there, and our families experienced that. Does this testimony speak to the effect of stigma in your view?
Well, I think that what she highlights there is this sense of having felt different. One of the leading writers in the area of stigma characterized stigma as an undesired differentness, and I would say that this is an illustration of how someone who is in a stigmatized group has that feeling of being different in an undesired way. And what she seems to be expressing here is that there was a brief time in 2004 when she felt that that difference had been removed, and that felt obviously very good to her.
Your Honor, I have no more questions at this time.
Very well. Mr. Nielsen, would you like to cross-examine?
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, I believe that our paralegal is getting the witness binders, so if you could...
More binders?
Yes, more binders. Your Honor, permission to approach?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. And good morning, Your Honor. And good morning, Professor Herrich.
Good morning.
Okay. I would first like to, Professor Herrich, I would first like to discuss your opinion regarding the definition of sexual orientation that you've offered. Now, social scientists conceive of sexual orientation as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon in...
Keep your voice up, counsel.
Yes, I apologize. Professor Herrich, social scientists conceive of sexual orientation as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon and operationalize it in a variety of ways, correct?
That is correct.
And most social and behavioral research has assessed sexual orientation in terms of attraction, behavior, or identity, or some combination of these constructs, correct?
That is correct.
Now, in this case, you said that, as commonly used, sexual orientation refers to an enduring pattern or disposition to experience sexual, affectional, or romantic desires for and attractions to men, women, or both sexes, correct?
Well, it also refers to patterns of sexual behavior and identities, but yes, also the patterns of attraction.
Okay, thank you. And specifically, with respect to the enduring pattern of affections, or an enduring pattern refers to something that goes beyond a momentary experience that is not repeated again in an individual's life. So we're talking about something that has at least some consistency over a period of time, correct?
That is correct.
But how long a period of time is not something that you think is specified by people who use that term, correct?
I would say that there's a general understanding that we're not talking about fleeting experiences or experiences that are specific to a very particular situation, but something that constitutes an important period of one's life.
So you think that what you see is that when you actually look at people's behavior and experiences, these are feelings and attractions that endure over a significant portion of time, beyond a few days, beyond a week, some period of time in the individual's life, correct?
That's correct.
And the term sexual orientation is also used to refer to an individual's sense of personal and social identity based on those desires and attractions, behaviors expressing them, and membership in the community of others who share them, correct?
Yes.
And there may be a distinction between social and personal identity, correct?
Yes, sometimes we think of personal identity as being something that is, well, actually, it's easier to start with social identity. Social identity is an identity that is based on a collective membership, a membership in a larger community. Personal identity can focus more on an individual's own personal life, on their idiosyncratic characteristics, their specific relationships with other people. And so both of those types of identity can be involved in sexual orientation.
All right, thank you. So specifically, it's also possible with a personal identity that an individual does not really feel that he or she is part of this larger collectivity, and that this is simply not a group with which he or she identifies, correct?
Well, some people can experience their sexual orientation as a purely personal thing and not feel a great sense of membership in or affinity with a larger gay or lesbian or bisexual community.
So in that case, the individual might feel that he or she doesn't want to be treated as a member of the group, that he or she wants to be understood as an individual, but nevertheless has a personal identity that it's related to his or her sexual orientation, correct?
Some people don't feel comfortable being subsumed into a collectivity, and so they prefer to be thought of as just as an individual, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, you use the word gay to refer collectively to men and women whose social identity is based on their homosexual orientation, that is, their sexual, affectional, or romantic attraction primarily to members of their own sex, correct?
I frequently use the word gay. Sometimes in talking about women who are homosexual in their sexual orientation, I use the word lesbian. That is sometimes a preferred term for women. And sometimes I and other writers or researchers in this area will refer to lesbian and gay to make it explicit that we're including both men and women in that group.
All right. And other than preferences of the individual, do you have a distinction between gay and lesbian other than the preference of the fact that gay could be used to refer to both sexes?
Well, gay can be used to refer to both sexes. There are some women who are lesbians who prefer not to use that term for themselves, but it is sometimes used generically, yes.
Okay, thank you. And an individual can label himself gay and yet not necessarily feel that he is part of what is sometimes called the gay community. Is that correct?
Well, that would be an instance where the individual feels a personal identity based on his presumed homosexuality, but doesn't have that sense of collective belonging.
Okay, thank you. And it could be that an individual's social identity is very much tied to being gay, but it might be that it is not, correct?
I'm sorry, could you, I didn't quite understand that question.
Yes, it could be that an individual's social identity is very much tied to being gay, but it could be that it is not, correct?
So some individuals do have a very strong social identity as part of being a part of that collectivity, and others do not. That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And although it's often discussed in terms of three categories, sexual orientation ranges along a continuum from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. Is that correct?
Well, this is a way of thinking about sexual orientation, or rather sexuality, that goes back at least to the days of Alfred Kinsey, in which he talked about a continuum ranging from exclusively homosexual in behaviors or attractions to exclusively heterosexual in behaviors or attractions. And so it's generally assumed that the continuum exists, although in practice we generally refer to three distinct groups: homosexuals, heterosexuals, and bisexuals.
All right, but do you believe that sexual orientation ranges along a continuum from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual?
Well, I believe that can be a very useful way of thinking about sexual orientation, yes.
Okay, thank you. Could you turn to tab 1 in the witness binder that I gave you? Now, this is a copy of the expert report that you filed in this case, correct?
Yes.
And could you turn to paragraph 21? It's on page 6. And in the third sentence of paragraph 21, you write, quote, "Although sexual orientation ranges along a continuum from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual, it is usually discussed in terms of three categories." And then you list the categories of heterosexual, homosexual, and bisexual, correct?
That's correct.
So you explicitly did offer that opinion in this case, correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Now, sexual orientation is always defined in relational terms and necessarily involves relationships with other individuals, correct?
Yes.
And sexual orientation is generally a characteristic that is not immediately obvious from simply looking at a person, correct?
In most instances, a person's sexual orientation is not readily apparent just from looking at them, unless, of course, the person is wearing some item or of apparel or a button or something that identifies them. But in general, no, it's not immediately evident what a person's sexual orientation is.
All right, thank you. Professor Herrera, could you please turn to tab 5 in the witness binder, and you'll find the document that's pre-marked PX0198. And could you identify this document?
Yes, this is an entry I wrote for the Encyclopedia of Psychology on the term homosexuality.
Thank you. And Your Honor, this was on the list, I believe, of exhibits that plaintiff offered, so I believe it's already in evidence.
Very well.
All right. On page 149, at the very beginning of the article, you write, quote, homosexuality encompasses a variety of phenomena related to same-sex sexual orientation. Although definitions of the term often focus mainly on sexual acts and attractions between persons of the same biological sex, homosexuality also refers to patterns of same-sex romantic and emotional bonding, identities and communities based on same-sex desires and relationships, and the shared culture created by those communities. Is that correct?
That's what I wrote.
And did you consider these definitions of homosexuality informing your opinion regarding the nature and definition of sexual orientation in this case?
I'm sorry, did I?
Did you consider these definitions of homosexuality informing your opinions that you've offered in this case?
Oh, yes.
Okay, thank you. And on the next column, on page 149, you write, homosexuality has at least 5 different components, correct?
Correct.
And then you list these, and they're in bold headings, continuing down the page as first, sexual attraction, desire, then sexual behavior, then identities, then, and turning on the next page, relationships and families, and then on the next page, communities, correct?
Right.
And did you consider these components of homosexuality when forming your opinion regarding the nature and definition of sexual orientation in this case?
Yes, I did.
All right. Now, homosexuality is usually understood as a counterpart to heterosexuality, with bisexual applied to individuals who manifest both heterosexual and homosexual behavior or attraction, correct?
Yes, and usually we reserve that for people who manifest what is called a significant amount of attraction or behavior with both sexes.
All right. Thank you for that clarification. And such labels, referring back to heterosexuality, bisexuality, and homosexuality, represent an oversimplification, correct?
Well, they can in some cases, yes.
All right, please look at page 149 of this exhibit in the second paragraph. And the first 2 sentences, the first sentence reads, homosexuality is usually understood as the counterpart to heterosexuality, with bisexuality applied to individuals who manifest both heterosexual and homosexual behavior or attraction. Such labels, however, represent an oversimplification. Correct? That's what you wrote in this article?
And then I went on to explain that although most people are consistent or display consistency in terms of their behaviors and attractions and identities, there are some people who don't. So we do see instances where people may express a particular attraction but don't necessarily have sexual behavior that conforms to that attraction, or there are other ways in which those don't always overlap.
So not all people display consistency among their sexual feelings, behavior, and identity, correct?
That is correct.
All right. Professor Herrera, please turn to tab 6 in the witness binder. And you will find an exhibit here pre-marked PX919. And can you identify this document?
This is another encyclopedia entry. This is from the Corsini Encyclopedia of Psychology and Behavioral Science, the 3rd edition.
Thank you. And again, this is one that you wrote.
Correct.
Your Honor, again, I believe this is in the plaintiff's list that they offered this morning, so I believe it's already in.
Very well.
Now, at the start of the document, you write, quote, homosexuality refers to sexual behaviors, desires, attractions, and relationships among people of the same sex, as well as to the culture, identities, and communities associated with them. Correct?
Correct.
Now, not all people with homosexual attractions develop a gay or lesbian identity, correct?
Not all people, correct. Not all people with homosexual attractions identify as lesbian or gay.
Okay, thank you. And not all people who identify themselves as gay engage in homosexual acts, correct?
Well, that is true for both heterosexuals and homosexuals and bisexuals.
Well, Many men, for example, regularly have sex with other men, but nevertheless label themselves as gay. Excuse me. Many men, for example, regularly have sex with other men, but never label themselves as gay or bisexual, correct?
This is a phenomenon that's been observed, yes.
Thank you. Please turn to tab 7 in the witness binder. And you will find a document pre-marked PX926. Professor Herrera, can you identify this document?
This is an entry or a paper that I co-authored with Dr. Linda Garnetz for the annual review of the clinical psychology, and the title is Sexual Orientation and Mental Health.
Thank you. Now, Your Honor, I believe PX926 is already in evidence, but if it is not, I would like to offer it.
I assume without objection?
We have no objection, Your Honor.
Very well.
Okay, thank you. On page 35, under the heading Historical Background, it says, quote, historically speaking, sexual orientation is a fairly new construct. Although heterosexual and homosexual behaviors have been ubiquitous across human societies, notions of the homosexual and the heterosexual, as well as the very idea that individuals can be defined in terms of their sexual attractions and behaviors, emerged in medical discourse only in the 19th century. Is that correct?
Well, if we go back in time, what we see is that these ideas of homosexuality and heterosexuality are probably, did probably emerge in medical discourse in the 19th century. They may have existed somewhat earlier than that in other types of understanding, but yeah, that is where we see them emerge in the medical discourse.
All right. And now, as we discussed earlier, in most empirical research, sexual orientation has been defined in terms of sexual attraction, sexual behavior, or self-labeling as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, correct?
Or perhaps as a combination of those in various ways.
Or some combination, thank you. And because individuals are not always consistently heterosexual or homosexual across these dimensions, research participants who are categorized as heterosexual by one criterion might have been classified as homosexual or bisexual if a different operational definition had been employed, correct?
The data indicates that there are at least some people for whom that would be the case, that we, although we see that the vast majority of people are consistent in their behaviors, their identity, and their attractions, it is the case that there are some who are not. And so it's true that there would be some differences in classification for that small group of individuals.
All right, thank you. Please turn to 362. It's at the very bottom of the page. And I'm going to read there, starting at the bottom and then continuing over to 363. And in fact, it's the sentence that starts at the very bottom of the second column. Can you see that? I'll read it.
Okay.
It is, indeed, two leading researchers in this area estimated that only half of the individuals who report sexual contact with a same-sex adult actually identify as lesbian, gay, or bisexual. Correct?
Well, I was pointing that out in the context of saying that there can be limitations for research that combines all sexual minority respondents into just one group of non-heterosexuals, because that undifferentiated category inevitably includes not only individuals who have this collective sexual orientation identity, but it also includes people who regard their sexuality in purely personal terms and perhaps only who engage occasionally in homosexual behavior without having any corresponding identity.
And that would be personal identity or social identity, would it not?
Possibly.
Okay. And in the next sentence, you write, consistent with this observation, the proportion of adults who identified as gay, lesbian, or bisexual in a 2000 national probability sample was roughly the same as the proportion who reported same-sex behavior but identified as heterosexual, correct?
That's what I wrote.
So essentially equal-sized groups of adults reporting same-sex behavior, half of them identifying as gay, lesbian, or bisexual, half identifying as heterosexual, correct?
I believe so. I have to say, this is a study by Drabble et al., and I haven't looked at that study recently, but I assume that that I said it correctly when I wrote it here.
All right, thank you. And did you consider these statements informing your opinions in this case?
Which statistics?
The ones that we just read.
About the relative number of people in various groups?
Correct.
I certainly am aware of them. I'm not recalling a specific instance in which I used them in writing my report, for example.
All right. So you may not have cited them, but you were aware of them.
I have been aware of them, yes.
Okay, thank you. Now the world in which today's sexual minority youth come to understand their sexual orientation is vastly different from that of previous generations, correct?
Well, I would say that the world is vastly different from previous generations in all sorts of respects.
All right, thank you. And indeed, not all manifestations of same-sex sexuality among contemporary youth are adequately accounted for by the labels gay, lesbian, and bisexual, and the identities associated with them, correct?
Well, for example, among youth, we see an embracing of the term queer, and people will use that as a self-descriptor, and that, of course, was a label of derision that was frequently used against a person who was perceived to be homosexual. Younger people have embraced that term, and they use it now as an identity label. So that's an instance where a term like gay, lesbian, or bisexual might not be applicable if an individual self-identifies as queer.
So do you agree with the statement that not all manifestations of same-sex sexuality among contemporary youth are adequately accounted for by the labels gay, lesbian, and bisexual?
I believe I wrote that statement, yes.
Okay, thank you.